Welcome back all. It's 11:10, so we can start back on the workshop and the remaining 2 sessions that we're going to have after the break now. Just to quickly mention that in the chat box, I've added our both projects, MAHSA and MAEASaM's social media account. So if you can please follow us and mention us if you are sharing any information about this workshop, and you can follow us to stay tuned about our events, work, progress, etc. So let's move on to our next presentation. We have our next speakers on, Ed and Renier here. Ed Burnett is from the McDonald Institute for the MAEASaM Project, and also from the MAEASaM Project we have Renier van der Merwe from the University of the Witwatersrand. They will talk to us today about the historical maps in Africa. So if I can ask you, I think Ed, you will start first. So if I can ask you to unmute yourself, and you should be able to share your screen as well.
It's not letting me.
We can't hear you, Ed.
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Still no.
Oh.
I can hear you, Ed.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen now, but we still cannot hear you.
I can hear. Oh.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
But still, we cannot hear you.
We can hear.
We can.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Nadia is saying that she can hear you. Maybe it's me. Yes, sorry.
Sorry. This wouldn't be a workshop without some sort of technical error. Okay, so if everyone can hear me and see
I'm
now.
very sorry, Ed. Yes, it was my problem. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some different ways that we've been doing things at MAEASaM, and also about a bit more detail about certain parts, and particularly going into, as you can see here, some things to do with verifying features. So far we've heard about how you might digitize a historical map, and then how you might georeference the historical map. I'm going to go over these a little bit as a brief refresher as well. But then I'm going to talk about some problems with verification as well, and some issues that I've encountered while working in Sudan. And then after that, Renier is going to go into a lot more detail, because yeah, he's had some particular success working in Southern Africa. So we've already kind of gone through this a little bit, but just again as a brief refresher, when you see a historical map, what are the useful parts, I guess, is the first question. I mean, in Africa, we have a lot more disparate map series than the ones that MAHSA are working on, because, I mean, there are 8 countries that our project is studying as well, and obviously there are more than that as well. And how they've been mapped has been very, very different in different areas. So, for instance, most of the parts that were colonized by the French, the maps are in French and they're in different places. There are all kinds of problems like that. Also, things aren't necessarily in as much detail. We have problems with scale. So here you can see that this map is on a fairly large scale, which means it contains not very much detail compared to the maps that MAHSA are working with. Really, anything larger than this is really useful, but 1 to 250,000 you can just about work with. So, you know, when you see a map series, there's a lot more investigation, I would say, that has to be done for the maps that we're working with as to whether or not it will end up being useful, which is why I'm suggesting all of these bits of information you can find on the sheets. So obviously, yeah, we have the scale, we have the sheet number, and also name sometimes, which obviously will follow a different system to the one which Junaid explained earlier for the maps in India, that these tend to be different even within the same country. You will have multiple versions that have different ways of referencing sheets, which is very annoying. And then you have a key. There's a part of the key on the bottom left. Again, some maps will not include any information that is useful at all, really, but some will contain a lot. So you can see, for instance, the antiquities are listed here in the same kind of Gothic font that you get here, if you can see my cursor. and you know, deserted villages are fairly useful because this map series is from the 1930s mostly. So if they were deserted almost 100 years ago, they're definitely interesting archaeologically. You can also see things like Qubas, Islamic dome tombs in this particular series, and a lot of other information as well in different ones. Then, as I've just mentioned, the year, which can tell you a lot about how, I mean, in one sense, older maps tend to be better in some cases because things that they include as current features might now be interesting, right? Whereas a more recent map, things that are current features are probably not as interesting archaeologically, although obviously that depends a lot on different circumstances. But the older ones are much less likely to be accurate. And something else that is often very useful to look at on these maps is little notes, right? So this one, for instance, lets you know that there are earlier surveys, which are what have been used to produce this map in the 30s, and things like boundaries have been updated, but in terms of the actual locations of things, they're based on these earlier surveys, which were also not very good. So there are a lot of inaccuracies in this particular map series as well, which is something that I've had to kind of deal with. And one thing you'll notice is missing here is any reference of a CRS, a coordinate reference system, or a spatial reference system, which is also a problem in of itself. These maps don't tell you how they've been made, really, at least as far as I've known in this particular series. In other ones, they will, and that's very useful for the georeferencing process, but in this one, they don't, and you have to kind of work with that, basically. Again, Gina, you sort of discussed where to find historical maps. One almost advantage of the disparate nature, I guess, of the mapping that we're working with in Africa is that there's a lot of places you can find them, and that includes online. So, for instance, the Peru Castaneda Library Map Collection at the University of Texas is very, very useful. The Library of Congress has the entire 1 to 250,000 series of Sudan from the 1900s, the early 1900s, available online, and I could just download all of them, which was pretty useful. But other things are not, which is why, of course, as we discussed earlier, you need physical collections as well. And I've been looking at various physical collections in the University of Cambridge libraries. So, you know, these are useful in different ways because they tend to be more extensive. Very few have been made available online. This is just a search in our library catalog for Sudan. But they can also be problematic in other ways, in that, for instance, it's very hard to tell what they have here. So for instance, here you can see each of the sheets of this series are listed separately in a confusing way. A lot of the time, the way that we think about things geospatially is not how librarians think about things. So for instance, the collections I've been looking through at the University of Cambridge libraries, they are listed alphabetically by name, but that means that multiple different places in Sudan are listed under different names. So it's a nightmare trying to find them. But again, this is all kinds of things that you have to deal with. We've already discussed georeferencing, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly. This is a little bit more in-depth look at the georeferencing system. You know, you need to open your raster, you need to add the points. You can move them around. This is in QGIS specifically, which is open source and is generally the one that both our projects use most of the time. ArcGIS has its own particular way of doing things as well, which will be different, and then other GIS software as well will be more different. But yeah, you create a large number of GCP points. As you can see here, it's a long list of them. You transform them, you select the way of doing it. As I've mentioned, this map series doesn't have a known CRS, so I've had to kind of go for one that is used later on later maps of Sudan. WGS84 also kind of worked, but this one seemed to be a better fit. But there you go. And then eventually, when you set it all up, you start georeferencing. You can do it in the background on your computer, things like that. As mentioned earlier as well, there were a kind of multiple ways to decide what GCP points you're going to use. So you can use just the intersections of points. I know this is what Jack's already spoken about, but I think it's worth mentioning again. and then you can just enter those. You type them in. For instance, this is 2415. This is basically one to the right from the previous one. But you can also, as you can see on the bottom here, click on from map canvas and then select the points as was done before. And I found my maps series is much less forgiving than the ones that Jack and Afifa have been using. And there are much less useful points to use. I've been using mountains because they tend to be a bit better. The rivers are very inaccurate most of the time, or perhaps have changed. The village settlements are often very ephemeral in the parts of Southwest Sudan, so it can be very difficult to use them as well. And because the scale is, is much larger, the kind of very small points that they're talking about, the intersections, are often very far off. So once you've done this kind of process, you can then sort of basically create shapefiles, which is the whole thing you do in GIS, draw around them, and then put them in Google Earth to see what you get. Is sort of the verification process. So here is, I've drawn around this old Turkish fort. As you can see, one thing you need to bear in mind when doing this sort of work is what counts as the point, right? So if you're on a very small scale, you could maybe even just use a little point, and then hopefully it will be in the same place. But on a very large scale, you have to draw a shape around it, and that shape may be very large in the space, as we'll see in a minute. And sometimes it's very unclear as to what is being referred to. So here we can see there's an old Turkish fort, obviously archaeologically interesting for us. But it's hard to tell whether that's referring to this little marker here, which normally would refer to this village of Damajavi right here. So I've kind of done it as a large polygon, and then you can zoom in, looking especially at this one area where it seems more likely to be, because it's a reference to a specific point, but might not be. And you can see nothing because it's not there, because there's been so many problems in the process of seeing this that we're very clearly way off. And I mean, this point may not even exist anymore as well, which is another problem, because it's been quite a long time since this was observed. There may be vegetation covering it. There are all kinds of other problems in trying to find things as well. So if we zoom out a little bit further, we can see that there's something that may be the fort, but which will require looking at possibly other imagery, things like that, in order to verify. And it is a whole kilometer away from the specified kind of most likely point. As you can see, the river was in a very wrong place, basically. And also, it's even further away from if we were using the text. So, this kind of situation creates problems, basically, is the first situation. And something else that can also create issues is, as I mentioned a bit earlier, is how you decide to georeference the map in the first place. So that these white lines here are based on just the points alone, if that makes sense, just the lines, not any real ground control points other than the coordinates given on the maps, because I've been lucky to have a lot of coordinates on those maps. Sorry, one sec. You can see here, this green circle here is the same well, but this is using a combination of a small number of the coordinates given on the maps, on the historical maps, and also a much larger number of ground control points based on natural features, primarily mountains, as I discussed earlier. But you can see neither of them really are particularly useful for identifying this mosque here, which is not really in the center of the text at all. And also, if you look here, you can see that this larger white square for the mosque, I have used the entire text. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the text written on the map describing the mosque will have a small point next to it, and you're unsure if that point is actually a reference to where the mosque is or not. So I've done it again, two different ways of doing it. In green, that's based on the point on the map, and the white is based on the much larger area, is based on the entire text describing the mosque. And if anything, the less specific one is better, because it meant I could search for the entire area. But it's such a large area, was it really that useful at all for me to find things like this? You know, so the point really is that there are a lot of different decisions that you have to make, and how you make those decisions can really affect the process of eventually verifying data. And so, for instance, I mean, some of our data is maybe even unverifiable in any way. As you can see from this well, it's not a kind of very obvious where it is at all. So we again have problems of, should we include that data in our database? How should we include it? If so, things like that. But it's not all pessimistic. As I mean, Renier will tell you briefly, he's had a lot more success with his things. But also, I mean, some of this information, particularly we have this situation in a lot of parts of Africa, is completely unretrievable otherwise. So most of the parts I've been working on at the request of NCAM in Sudan have been in Darfur, where there's been almost no archaeological work ever carried out. There are perhaps 1 or 2 publications, not really very much. None of them really map anything. So this kind of historical maps data is basically, I don't know, irreplaceable in that sort of situation. And again, as it says here, some sites, even if they're mentioned as current at the time, such as wells, they could be fairly old. I mean, wells can exist for a long time before, obviously, they're mapped. And even then, it's quite a long time since then as well. And again, as I said, many map series are a lot easier to work with than this particular one. I'm just kind of providing a sort of idea of a lot of the problems that you can encounter. I have one final thing as well, which is a plug for our social media, really, where recently I posted about something quite cool that we found. We found this old fort in Darfur, again, something which is we might have noticed if we were doing systematic Google Earth surveying, but why would we have known to check this area, things like that. In this case, it's very, very recognizable on Google Earth. It wasn't very far off based on the historical map. And we know that it was old 100 years ago, and therefore is, you know, archaeologically interesting. But yeah, this is based on a post on our social media, so please go on and follow us there, and you can check in with how this work is progressing and how we're trying to deal with all of these issues. So I'm now going to pass over to Renier, who's going to go into a little bit more detail with his case study as well. But thank you very, very much for listening. And as it says here, ask any questions in the chat, and we'll talk about them afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Let me just quickly share my screen. Can everybody see it?
Yes, thanks, Renier.
Yes. Okay, good day, everyone. As Ed mentioned, I'm going to go into a bit more, well, not say detail, but I'm going to be looking more specifically at the type of historical maps that we're using in Southern Africa. So generally in Southern Africa, we have 3 types of historical maps that we use. We have the topographical maps that my co-presenters have also been going into quite detail. We have larger regional maps, which tend to date to the 18th and 19th centuries. And then we also have maps drawn by the explorers and scientific expeditions that came into the interior of the continent, also in the 19th century. Now, each map has its advantages and its disadvantages, and we get different types of information from the different types of maps. Now, the topographical map series we generally use is the 1 to 1 million that Ed mentioned, the 1 to 250,000, and the 1 to 50,000. Now, each one of these gives us different types of information, and depending on your question or your goal, you can use one better than the other. Now, as Ed mentioned, the 1 to 1 million series generally has very limited information, so we don't tend to use it that often. But sometimes what makes these maps quite handy is they have important features that are indicated but might not be as prominently displayed in the smaller scale maps. One example, as you can see there, is that circle of the cross indicates the location of a mission station. Now, in Southern Africa, especially in the interior, mission stations were very important features on the landscape during the 19th century. And as the full-scale social disruptions that occurred through this area known as Mafekane were occurring, a lot of communities fled to the safety provided by the mission stations. So finding these on maps can greatly help you to find archaeological sites in the area as well. Well, this specific site map is of the Kalahari area of Botswana at the Okavango Delta. And what makes these nights is also indicating the place of watering holes. Now, especially in the Kalahari area, these watering holes weren't stable, so they might have been present for 20 or 30 years and didn't disappear. So knowing where these locations are can also help you find settlements within these drier areas. The other one we use is 1 to 250,000. As you can see, it has quite a lot of very nice specific detail. The specific one is of the Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe, covering an area that we know called the Nyanga complex. Now, what makes this map interesting is in the case of the Nyanga complex specifically, is it gives you different layers of information. Now, we know the Nyanga complex had 4 different types of settlements, and all 4 of these types are actually indicated on this map if you know how to look for. The one key feature of the Nyanga complex called forts, which aren't similar to the European concept. These were more areas where communities fled to for safety, not the specific military in nature. But as you can see, they are also indicated on this map. Just a few of them are highlighted in red. And then you have your general ruins, your general settlements that are also indicated. You can see there are quite a lot of them on the specific map. And then you also have your more historical features. Now, this field museum, although it is a modern creation, was already built in the 1920s. So when this map was drawn in 1970s, it was still there, and today it is a historical site in its own right as well. Then another feature of the Nyanga culture that's quite unique to them was the location of pits within the middle of their settlements. And these are also indicated on the map as pits. So although you need a little background in archaeology to understand the significance of the pits, these themselves are also indicating the location of settlements. And then you get some more general information, like for example, the ancient terracing. The Nyanga complex is renowned for their extensive terracing covering thousands of kilometers, and the entire mountain ranges in this area are completely covered in terracing. And if you look closely here at the area called Funikak ruins, which is today called Ziwa, you'll see there's only one indication for a ruin there. Now, this is important for the next map. So the next series that we use is the 1 to 50,000, which is a lot more detailed. And again, you get similar information like the location of sites. But as you can see in this specific one, sometimes on the 1 to 50,000, you get more information than you would on the 1 to 250,000. And the case that this one indicates 2 more ruins. However, what you should keep in mind is that on these maps, not all archaeological sites, even in the known area, will be indicated. This area, if you look at the boundary lines here, indicate the boundary extent of the Ziwa National Monument in Zimbabwe. And this area, just viewed here, actually contains over 500 settlements, and only 3 of them are indicated here. So these maps are a good place to start, but you should always keep in mind that there's most likely a lot more on the landscape than is indicated on these maps. And then you also have your normal other information like the historical monuments and that. And what makes these maps nice, if you have different series and different periods, is you can also use them to match each other to see which one is more accurate. Is there a large discrepancy between them? Has the site potentially been moved? Because especially in Southern Africa, we often have sites of the same name being moved to different locations. And these maps can help you also pinpoint movements like that. And then you also have the terracing that's also mentioned on the 1 to 250,000. Now, a lot has already been said about the accuracy of topographical maps. I'm not going into too much detail about that. I would just like to point out that accuracies on a map can differ even if the map itself is accurate. If you look at this area known as a drift, there you can see on the topographical map to the top left, top right, and the bottom, the overlay on the satellite image, the 2 of them match very good. These rivers are not wide, so you do have a lot of sandbanks developing, but you can see there's a very good overlay there. Again, the section of the curve of the river, you can again see there's quite nice overlap between the topographical map and the satellite imagery. However, if you just go a kilometer to the south and this bend over here, you can see there it's indicated on the historical map, but if you look there, it's quite a distance away from the actual river. Now these are granite hills, so this river valley hasn't moved, so the river course hasn't changed. This is just simply an inaccuracy on the map itself, which is not the general inaccuracy of the map type. This is just an error that was made on the specific map. And then human-made features can also vary in extent of their accuracies. Now, on a 1 to 250,000 map, you do expect some degree of error. So this is an example of a Nyanga fort, which I mentioned earlier. And this is the fort on the map. It's called Chawamba Fort. And if you look at the bottom here, this is the area located after being geo-referenced, where the map indicates the fort to be. However, that is the location of the actual fort. So in this case, we have a 200-meter error between where the map said the fort is and the actual location, which on a size scale we're working with is actually surprisingly good. Some of our sites have larger errors, some of them have smaller ones. Then we get to the regional maps. Now, these were maps typically made covering the whole of Southern Africa. Most of them cover the territories of Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, Eswatini, and Lesotho. And they give you an indication of the historical development of the area, as well as how information can change over time. Now, as you can see, these two maps, 1828 and 1836, the red dot here indicates the mission station Kuruman, which was the starting point in this region for all the expeditions that were heading into the interior. And the circles around here indicate Kurachani, which is a very well-known site in the 19th century. You can see the difference in information that you're starting to get as more and more expeditions are going into the interior. The information start getting filled in. Again, 1854 and 1872, the same region with Kurachani there, Kuruman there and there. Again, you start seeing more and more information. However, one thing you should always keep in mind with these regional maps is where they themselves also got their information from. Because often these maps build on older maps to get their information as well. So in this case of the 1836 map, and 1854 map, they actually used the same source to draw some of their maps. As you can see, this line here is the route of a famous explorer in Southern Africa called Archibald. He was one of the first to explore the region. And this route is also indicated on this map here. What this indicates to us is that both these maps used either his journals or maps drawn of his expeditions to get information from their specific maps. What this means is inaccuracies inherent in the one automatically get transferred to the other as well. And just to highlight the route a bit more clearly, you can also already see the difference just in the route itself and the course of the rivers between these two maps, even though they cover the same area with the same information. So these are errors and inconsistencies that you'll just have to keep in mind when working with these types of maps. Then the last type we generally use is your first-hand accounts, and they generally fall into two types of maps. You have the maps drawn by the expeditions themselves, as illustrated by this one. And then you also have the first-hand account maps drawn by the authors who published the accounts themselves. To the right is a famous one of the missionary Robert Moffat as he went to the Matabele Kingdom. And the right is also a famous one by a scientific expedition of Andrew Smith. Now, each one of these maps are valuable in their own right, and each of them do also have errors inherited. The advantage of the third-hand accounts that have maps drawn while the expedition was occurring is that you get a more detailed route that the expedition itself took and the areas that they visited, which can become quite nice if you're using this in conjunction with the third-hand account to track down settlements mentioned in the accounts. They also often give you information of other expeditions in the area, which you might otherwise not have known were there. And this allows you to track down additional information for the area that you're interested in. And the ones drawn by the publishers, although they tend to be more accurate in their geographical display, also have built-in inaccuracy because they just simply connect one part of the map to another one. In this example here, you can see the black line is the route of Andrew Smith according to the author of the publication. Yet the red line is the actual route the expedition did based on a systematic reconstruction of the route based on their first-hand accounts. So each of these are useful in their own right, but the problems and inaccuracies should be kept in mind when using them. You can see there the error difference between that section of the route where other sections match up quite nicely. So we have a very different types of sites that we can identify from these historical maps for use for our projects. The one, as I was already shown you, was the example of a Nyanga fort, which is clearly visible on Google imagery, although you don't always know where they are. So having them indicated on a map can greatly speed up the process of finding them. But other sites, like rock art sites, you might not know exist at all unless you physically go into the area. So having them indicated on historical maps like this makes it quite handy to find them because you will not be able to locate them from satellite imagery. What another nice thing about these historical maps is they can also help you track down sites that have been destroyed. So that allows you to document them and reconstruct the historical landscape, even though the site's not existing anymore. A nice example of this is in the Eastern Islands of Zimbabwe. If you look at the red dot, that's the site indicated on the historical map as being a pit ruin. And as you see there, there's a slight bit of development occurring next to it. But in 2009, the red dot again illustrating the site, but you can see the development is starting to increase as well as to the south of it. And unfortunately, by 2013, the entire site was overlaid by farming and a large section of it has been destroyed. Now, if this site wasn't documented on a historical map, you might still have been able to find it in the historical imagery, but depending on the quality of the historical imagery and its availability, sites like these might be lost if you use only satellite imagery, which makes historical maps also useful to track down sites. Other types of sites we can indicate, fine, like this is the Z1 National Monitor I mentioned earlier, that only had that one dot on a 1 to 250,000. So this is a satellite image taken, and all the circular structures you can see here, those are actually settlements. They're known as pit enclosures. And then you also have the terracing here. And as I also mentioned, there's often a lot more in the landscape than these maps indicate, even if they tell you they are ruins. And this is the area just further to the south. Again, you can see all these circular features which indicate the settlements with the terracing. And these weren't indicated on the historical map at all. So although the historical maps are quite useful, you should always keep in mind that they're often also limited in the information they give. And then another nice example in the Nyanga area is further up in the highlands, known as the pit enclosures. These were the earlier settlements of the Nyanga culture. And here you can see them quite nicely. There is the pit with the feature around here where the settlement housing would have been. There again with the terracing. And what's nice about this specific one is it was indicated on a historical map. And the area surrounding this map has a lot of depressions, which on first sight just look like natural features. But knowing the archaeology of the area and the fact that this ruin was indicated as a ruin, we now know that these depressions are actually the remains of pit structures in their own right, which indicate that this area had an extremely dense settlement period, with almost 100 pit structures being found within a 5 to 10 kilometer area. So it was quite densely occupied for a very short period. The historical maps will help you not only reconstruct the landscapes in the past and help find these sites, but by tracking how they changed, you can also reconstruct population movements in the past and also how these sites will now be impacted with modern development. Thank you.
Many thanks to Ed and Renier for their wonderful presentation on historic maps in Africa in general, the type of different maps and how they're used in MAEASaM's projects to identify any possible sites. If you have any questions, please, you can either raise your hand, or if you haven't typed already in the chat box, you can type them in the box. There was a comment from Felipe that Faye provided an answer to it, but it was a question to Ed asking about the crowdsourcing. So Felipe, do you want to ask your question, and we can see if Ed has any also thoughts to add on this point, and whether these locations are accessible for local community to provide any information.
Hi Ed, it was a really interesting talk, and I was just wondering this aspect of the possible crowdsourcing of like not necessarily going there, but like engaging with the people who live in the area that might actually provide a more accurate description of what are around, especially that you're showing that a lot of these are like fairly big ruins or structures. I thought that this could be a possibility, but I don't know like logistically how that would be feasible. So it's just like an idea as well. Don't know if it's something that you're looking into it.
Yeah, so we're still in the process of finally sorting out our agreements with the various countries that our project works with. So I think probably that seems like something we would need to kind of wait for that to be determined. It does seem it's definitely very interesting, and as Faye said, I think it could be an option. I agree with Faye. It's, as you say, there will be logistic constraints with that. So I'm not going to firmly say whether or not we can do it. I would say it would be difficult, but I think it would definitely help us with a lot of the problems we've encountered in terms of very specifically getting things down. I mean, I know that things to do with, I forgot to mention this actually in the presentation, but I found as an example of the kind of volume of data that we can get, when I've been looking through the Darfur area and kind of adjacent areas of Sudan, if they're included in the map, I've got over 1,600 different points of archaeological interest from just this 250,000 series, and there are more series that may be interesting in the future. But yeah, but my point was almost all of them, probably over 2/3, are wells, which are pretty difficult to verify. So yeah, I do agree that crowdsourcing could really help with things like that, in that you can just ask people if they know where the local well is. But it's, yeah, I'm not going to firmly say as of yet. But thank you very much for the question.
Just quickly want to add, Felipe, in Southern Africa, community involvement, or speaking with the communities, are quite a critical part in the research process. And a lot of our very well-known historical or archaeological sites were actually found thanks to the local community informing the researchers that these sites were there. So in Southern Africa, it is quite a well-used and important part of the research project.
Thanks very much. We have 2 hands up. Kazala was first, and then we'll see with the time. We might need to answer Hamid's question in the chat, but let's see, Kazala, if you can go ahead and quickly ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. My question is very simple to Renier. I'm doing a study in Zimbabwe on the Great Zimbabwe Culture site, and basically I'm trying to do some kind of field work. So, but then I'm very interested in the historical maps. Would you kindly help me how I would deal with using field research and these historical maps as well, and in terms of what kind of methodology should I use towards the use of historical maps combined with field work, and also combination with satellite imagery?
Okay. For your type of research, it will be quite interesting to see, because the Zimbabwe culture, because it's so old, a lot of it actually predates the historical map period. So it will be quite interesting to see your results. Now, standard methodology that we use when combining these methods like you discussed is, the advantage of being able to use field notes is that you know of the physical sites that do actually exist and you know where they are. Then what you can do is you can see if any of these sites that you know do exist are present on any of the historical maps that you have. And this, what makes this useful is you can use the physical sites that you know of as sort of anchor points for your historical map. So as you know where the sites you do know are, where they're located is, and how they are represented on the historical map. This will tell you the complexity of the map, its accuracy, as well as the type of sites mentioned. Then when you have this information, you can start looking at the other sites also mentioned on the map. And by using the accuracy you now know, you can translate that over to something like Google Earth, and then look in the areas where the map indicates the ruins will also have been present. Now, because you know the general inaccuracy or accuracy of the map, you'll be able to compensate for the error placement and then narrow down this search on Google Earth. Luckily for your area of Zimbabwe, there is quite a lot of historical imagery also available on Google Earth. And this is quite important to go through the historical imagery because you have changes in vegetation, especially in the drought periods where a lot of the settlements will actually stand out quite more than they would in more recent ones due to the rains. And some of the satellite imagery also have contrasts built in, which also makes some of the settlements come quite nicely. So what a best way approach in that case would be is always use the field notes to sort of give yourself a foundation of how to read and interpret the historical map. And then from there, go to the satellite imagery and see if you can find the site mentioned on the maps.
Thank you very much. I hope I could also get in touch with you for more in-depth knowledge.
Please feel free to contact me at any time.
Thanks very much. And just very quickly, Hamid, if you'd like to ask your question, but very quickly as we're running behind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be short. My question is for Rani. I would like to know about the significance of historical maps in the identification of rock art or rock, carvings, and plus also in identifying the ancient routes which were used during that particular period. Or
that will depend quite extensively on the specific map you have. The map series I illustrated for Zimbabwe does actually illustrate quite a large amount of rock art sites and rock engraving sites on them, which does allow us to find them via satellite imagery. But again, that depends on the map. Some of the South African maps don't do this. So if you do have a nice historical map that indicates this, they can be quite handy to find. What I've also found is the first-hand account maps. If you're able to correlate the first-hand entry of the maps generated, and they mention rock art sites or engravings, such as the route of Andrew Smith, you can also find those sites via the map that's published and the route account, which will help you to find sites that, unfortunately, as in the case of South Africa, has already been destroyed. As to tracking down the historical routes that were used, these maps are actually historical, especially the regional maps, are quite useful in this regard, because a lot of the maps were drawn by information obtained from explorers and traders who went into the interior and came back. So they automatically included the routes they took on their expeditions, which the map creators then incorporated. And in your drier areas like the Kuruman region, all the explorers and expeditions use the same route. So you can actually reconstruct the routes and the trading routes via these maps, depending on the region. The eastern part of Southern Africa isn't as extensively covered. Now, as to finding the historical sites and the ruins, these maps are quite important. One of the most famous sites discovered in the last 20 years, Kuruchane, was chiefly discovered by the use of historical maps and first-hand accounts. It was a very large settlement consisting of 2 sections, and now that we know where it is, you can see it on Google Earth satellite imagery. But it was completely forgotten up until the 1990s, until it was rediscovered by using these 2 methods, because unfortunately the site was destroyed in the 1820s during the Mfecane. So it does help quite a lot to find the ancient sites.
okay, thank you very much.